Hi, I'm Charlotte and this is Tired Mama Tries to Read, and I got some very interesting reviews because there's some books in here that have done unexpected things. They've either been better than I thought or they've been a lot worse than I expected. There's some controversial reviews in here, so prepare yourselves to be mad. So I'm going to start with something that I talked about a little bit last time, which is Tom Hanks's Uncommon Type. I hope you can see that. The lighting is quite bright in the window, but hopefully you can see that. So I kind of was about halfway through this when I talked about it with you last time, and this just goes to show that sometimes DNFing isn't the way. So I was reading this with Joe, and that was the reason I carried on, because we were reading it together and we were getting a lot out of the messages we were sending one another about the stories. But by the time I finished it, I felt very endeared towards it, and I'll tell you a couple of reasons why. So one is that he just loves typewriters, okay? This is a man who adores typewriters. At the beginning of each of the short stories are sort of pictures of really unusual typewriters that are all in his possession, as far as we know. I'll find you that's quite a cool one. Beautiful shots of these typewriters, and they feature in every story as well. So every story has a typewriter in there somewhere, and it's the typewriter that's featured in the picture. So this is a man who's really sort of dedicated to the art of writing. You know, it's a really beautiful thing, and I respect that. And also what really struck me by the time I got to the end of the collection was how much he dared to do. So he really tried to create short stories that go across all sorts of genres. He's got like a sci-fi story, he's got a kind of comedic farce story where there's sort of silliness and it's a bit impossible, but you know, it's fun. He's got stories about people's lives. He's got these little sort of, it's interspersed with these sort of faux newspaper columns, which are kind of some of the weakest points, but even they at the end start to endear you as well. Stories about single mothers, stories about fathers who are going to betray their wives, stories about absent parents, about immigrants. We've got historical fiction in there as well. He's done across the board, and I kind of feel like I'm a person who, yes, he's Tom Hanks, we know him as an actor, we're kind of endeared towards him as an actor, and I felt that if it wasn't for him I probably wouldn't have carried on reading. But I felt at the end that actually he was somebody who was dedicated to stories. Now, I don't know whether he's a big reader in his personal life or whether his reading is that of reading script stories. But I feel like he must have experience of reading short stories and enjoying them, because he gets it pretty good. Some of the early stories resolve a little bit too well. Me and Joe both felt that they had too clear an ending, and a short story is often a little bit... Oh, I was like, can you hear the ticking of... I brought a clock in because I know I'm going to overrun. Let me put it over here so I can see it, but you can't hear it. Yeah, so he... some of them are a little bit too finite for a short story, really. But that doesn't happen in all of them. And I don't know, what I kind of felt was that he had a real... he had a voice and he had a story to tell, and he actually did it really well. And a couple of the stories he actually did do a really good job, I thought. So I would give this a strong 3 stars, which sounds really awful, and I would never pick up a book that someone I respected had said was only 3 stars. But there's more to it than that. I think the only thing that really lets it down, I mean, the prose isn't like sparkling, okay? So it's not bad, it's certainly not clunky, but it's not... yeah, there's nothing you're really going to underline in there. What really lets it down is that even though he's trying so hard to be inclusive, there's a lot of stuff in there that's written in a post-Trump world. You know, he's writing stories about immigrants, about them sometimes illegally coming to the United States, but how it's the rules that are the problem and not the illegal immigrants. He's trying really hard to be inclusive and diverse, but both me and Joe felt he was trying a little bit too hard, and that at the end of it all, he still might be of an era where it was okay to smack a woman's bum and it be a joke. if you get what I mean. Like, there's nothing in there where that happens, but I always sort of judge a man's writing by how many times he puts red lipstick on a woman, and he puts red lipstick on these women quite a lot. So that's kind of where I'm going with it. That's the thing that lets it down for me. But other than that, I think it's a valiant attempt by somebody who this is his first work. Yeah, so there we go. I know that sounds like a weird review, but if it brings out another collection, I will read it. Now we move on to the book of my life. Wendell Berry, his book Hannah Coulter. So when I say the book of my life, I mean sometimes you read a book and you just think, wow, that's just totally changed me, or it's spoken to me. That's how I feel about this book. I'm not going to go into massive detail purely because loads of people have reviewed it recently and I just agree with most of what they've said. I read this with Kate Howe, and she's not quite finished, but we've both just absolutely loved it, and I've just underlined so much of it. There's just constant little comments, and I tend to do things where I put little hearts next to bits I really like, and I was just constantly writing little hearts. And this is the first time I've done this in years and years and years, if ever, but I phoned my parents straight away and I said, you need to buy this book. And they were like, can't we borrow yours? I said, no, you're going to need your own copy. And I feel like if they don't like it, it's going to put a massive spanner in the works with our parent-daughter relationship. So it's awesome. If you didn't know the premise, I'll just quickly tell you. It's Hannah Coulter, an old lady who was a farming, she lived a life on a farm in, where? Kentucky, okay. And it's about her reflecting upon her life, the men that she loved, the children that she had, the farming life, and how it has changed. And if that sounds boring to you, well, there's no sort of great big plot twists or anything. If that sounds boring to you, I suppose maybe do give it a miss, but there's so much more to it than that. It's also a massive treaty against war. There's descriptions at the end that will just blow you away and have you in tears. I mean, I cried through a lot of it, which is, again, unusual. How am I doing for time? Okay, not too bad. Now we come on to a book that is going to make me very unpopular to say I didn't like, I think. It's Sally Rooney's Conversations with Friends. Now, I know that the big deal is Normal People. That's been all over the place. And I would, unless I hear differently in the comments below, I will not be picking up Normal People based on this book. And I'll tell you why. Okay, so awesome writing. This is just such a different contrast to like Tom Hanks, whose prose was pretty sort of meh. And this was just out of this world prose. It was awesome. You know, it was really well done. The voice was very clear. The character of Frances, I felt she was really palpable. And I can imagine a lot of people would relate to her, especially sort of in their early 20s. I can imagine tons of people were reading that and just going, wow, this is me. You know, she feels like she doesn't have a personality. She feels like she's got to almost create herself when she meets people. She's creative, but when she actually finds a romance, she becomes completely blocked creatively. She relies a lot on her vivacious best friend, who she feels is like the better version of her, almost like she's doing her but better. And I think we've all had that competitiveness with other women. So there was loads of it that was great. I think what for me let it down was just the basic storyline. So it's not a spoiler because basically the whole book is about her and her best friend Bobby, I think it is. Yeah, Bobby. They become sort of involved in the life of this older married couple. And when I say older, we're talking like late 30s, early 40s. So not massively old, but when you're in your early 20s, that is older. They are an actor and a photographer. And these two young women who are just completely naive, but thinking they know everything about the world, get involved in this marriage in ways they can't expect. And what I found really frustrating was that I felt it was almost an endorsement of betraying people, lying to people and having affairs. Now, I know that sounds really moralistic. I don't know how to defend myself. I've thought about this loads in my head as to how to defend myself on that train of thought. But there's one character in here who does actually stick his neck out and say, what you're doing is really wrong. And they belittle him. He comes off as a bit silly. Later on, he makes a comment that makes it look like he's massively blown out of proportion what actually happened, and it destroys the validity of his statement, what you're doing is wrong. And I think ultimately you know, it's like when you watch something really trashy on TV, like some sort of soap where everybody's cheating on everybody, and it comes to a point where you just think to yourself, are people really like this? Does everybody just cheat on everybody? Am I completely naive that I don't think it's in my world? Is it happening to me and I don't even know about it? Is it happening in other people's lives and we're just not the norm? I find when I see all that stuff on TV and when I'm reading about it in a book and there's no moralisation whatsoever, that it's almost seen as it just can't be helped, these people have got to cheat, I find it frustrating. You know, I find it lazy that none of the people in that circle will come out and say, what you're doing is really wrong. And my duty as a friend is to tell you that what you're doing is really wrong. And I'm not talking about this from a moral standpoint of utter purity, so please don't think that. What I'm saying is that there's times in my life where I wish someone had told me that various things that I've done in life have been morally ambiguous, to say the least. And that I like to think that now I've grown up, as a friend, I would be the person to question someone else's moral choices. So all the way through, I felt that the bad decisions being made, especially by the lead character Frances, were just never really discussed in terms of how hurtful they were. And then just the fact that it's just, I think I read a review on Goodreads that somebody said it was just suffocating, the amount of bad choices she was making and the way that this relationship was going, and I completely agree. You know, there's just no resolution. There's, you know, the end just sends you right back to where you started, basically. And Frances herself, despite saying that she's got to create this persona that she doesn't even think is her anymore, when she's sending she sends lots of emails during this situation that's developed, and she's just so cold and harsh, and loads of people say, you know, that they think she's cold, and I kind of waited for her to change, to develop, to grow as a character, and she just didn't. She kept giving out this false view of who she was, and then she was completely surprised when things didn't go her way because she'd not given anything of herself. And again, that's okay, but then I would like that to have been discussed in the narrative about how, you know, I'd like one of the other characters to say, well, if you were just honest for once about what you actually want, maybe you'd get it. But she just doesn't. She just cloaks herself constantly in this air of I don't care about anybody. And there was no discussion of why that was doing her wrong. So I was furious by the time I got to the end of the book. And the prose was the only thing that kept me going. And kind of also just wanting to rant about it was what kept me going. And I don't even think I can keep it on the shelf, people. Can't even do that. So I'd love to hear what you think. I can understand why a lot of people might relate to it. But I am now the friend that will tell you it's not a good idea to cheat. So that's where I'm coming from. Then I read this. Now, this was a surprise. I went somewhere and forgot a book, which is every book lover's worst nightmare. And I went and borrowed this because I knew I had it at home. So I borrowed it and then put it back. It's called A Rope of Vines by Brenda Chamberlain. I don't know if you can see that photo, but I love this painting. This is by Brenda Chamberlain. I love this hunched character here, and just, you know, the look of kind of, it looks sort of flat, but like, I don't know, there's just something really disturbing about this figure sort of zooming up to them on the boat. This is a journal from a Greek island. So this is a book I've had for years and years and years because it's Library of Wales, which you all know I love, but I've never got round to reading it because there's always something better, yada yada yada. But I was forced into reading it and I'm so glad I did. About halfway through the book I was thinking, you know, it's freezing cold, she's telling me all about this Greek island, I'm not really that interested. Yes, the prose is amazing, but, you know, it's written in diary form and it's very quick and digestible. It's got all these really cool illustrations by Brenda Chamberlain, but I just wasn't getting into it. And then all of a sudden, part 2 started and I was just hooked. The way I would describe it is a discussion of what it's like to be a person, especially a woman, and the limits of yourself. Sounds really weird. So she talks a lot about cells. So she talks about the cell within a nunnery. So the actual, you know, the rooms that they live in are often referred to as cells. And there's lots of thoughts about, is it anchorites? Have I said that right? God, we did loads of this in uni. I think it's an anchorite, who is a woman, please correct me if I'm wrong, typically a woman, who literally isolates herself within a cell. She never has any contact with the human world ever again. She has a little tiny sort of slot in the door where she'll have her food delivered and things that she's doesn't need any more. I'm trying to think of a way of politely putting this. I'm guessing there's a toilet in there, but I don't know. Taken away, and she just devotes herself to the Bible, etc. And she just completely removes herself from the world. There's an element of that to this. So this is based on reality that Brenda Chamberlain, she lived on the Greek island of Idra for 7 years. And in the novel, she starts on, in the diary extract, she starts on the island. So there you've limited yourself. You're on an island, you're restricted, you're in a cell of sorts. Then she actually moves up into the nunnery and stays with them in part 2, which is where it gets really interesting. So then she's in a physical cell. She's isolated her world even more. And then she becomes sort of emotionally obsessed with another person who's gotten into legal trouble on the island, and she sort of zooms into the cells of her own body. And it's just, I know that sounds really pretentious and kind of like, you know, dissertation-y, but it is really good and it works, and it's not, there's so much more to it than just the surface, but the surface is in itself really lovely. There's lots of stuff about simplicity. You know, she doesn't have electricity in her little house. She doesn't really have a proper toilet as we would know it. She's living on things like olives fresh from the tree, freshly baked bread. She's sleeping outside. There's lots of wildlife involved. Yeah, it's a hard life, and she doesn't disguise how hard it is to live on an island. And she herself is basically paying people to look after her because she's from Europe, and well, obviously Greece is in Europe, but she's from Britain. She's got money. She's a writer. She's not got a lot of money, but goes a long way in Greece. So it's just really interesting, this idea of isolating yourself. It's kind of what I tried to do with my shed. I've tried to remove myself to be creative. And well, the Greek island worked a lot better than the shed has for me. So I would recommend that. And then the last thing I'm going to really quickly talk about, because I think I'm edging up to 15 minutes now, is how we are getting on with our War and Peace buddy read that we're doing. We are now on page 192. We're at chapter 18. I've just caught up with the other girls because I was a bit behind. And we're in the war bit. We're in part 2. There's a lot of war. It is not interesting, I'm not going to lie to you. There are interesting bits, and Tolstoy is a very smart writer, so there's always something that catches your eye that I'm underlining, and then I bring it back to the group and we chat about it. Just little turns of phrase, the way he describes things like the enemy looking like alien beings, the fact that the what's the other thing? You know, he describes the officers' faces who all seem to be looking for something. You know, he doesn't just gloss over them. He's trying to analyse what it's like to be in an army. So there's loads of interesting stuff in there, like little bits. But overall, the descriptions of how one battalion comes up and then another one's coming from the left and I just can't follow it. I've got no head for being able to visualise that at all. I just can't do it. So it's a fault of my own. But I'm finding those passages virtually... I mean, I'm literally glossing through to find a comment about people, and then I'm reading that, but I'm not bothering to read in any true sense of the word the descriptions of how the battle works, because I know I'm not going to remember it. So yes, it's happening. We're still doing it. If you want to read along, it's still completely possible to catch up with us. We are now on chapter 18 of part 2. And we're very excited because there's only a few more chapters of part 2, and then we're into part 3, and we think we're back with all the princesses and all the society stuff, which is just a lot more interesting. So I'm going to wrap it up. I have got more stuff to say about War and Peace, but I've got a whole year to tell you, so I'm not going to rush. I hope you're all having a really good reading week, and please let me know what you think of some of the books I've talked about, because I've got some controversial things, you know, going on with those, and I'm more than happy to be told I'm wrong. So yeah, I will speak to you soon. Bye.